So I want to consider now some of the global drivers. We've been thinking more about processes that happen within fishing communities and at local level up to now. But social and economic change at larger scales also impacts fishing communities. One of the key debates around fishing is the extent to which small-scale fisheries in low-income, food-deficit countries should develop an export orientation. Okay, so the basic argument is that, well, by exporting some of your products to people who are able to pay a larger amount for them, you generate export markets, you generate foreign exchange. This feeds into the economic development of the country. It allows the government to spend on poverty-reducing infrastructure, and it allows a private sector that's capable of engaging with global markets to develop. The other side of the story is that people worry that channeling a food product out of a country where there's a demand for it leaves people nutritionally worse off, that people in a position to get the benefits of trade revenues are the wealthier, and that poorer people, smaller scale operators get marginalized in the process. And I don't know how many of you have seen the film Darwin's Nightmare. Have any of you seen it? Yeah, a few. Let's have your film critic input.
Yeah. I don't agree much in it because I just don't know the intention of super. But on a study that was done on Lake Victoria, I work with the Tanzania Fisheries Research Institute. And a study that was done shows that fishers eat fish more than any other thing. But here comes a story that was saying that most of fish are exported, fishers are not consuming fish. So a lot of critique about it.
Yeah. No, I think that there was a lot of critical feedback, as you said, on this film, that it portrayed a very exaggerated sense of the harm that trade was doing, that it set out with a story to show that trade was exploitative, and it only told one side of the story. And the issue of the Nile perch, which is the main target for these exports from Lake Victoria. This is a film about Lake Victoria's fish trade. They were basically saying that all that was left for local people to eat were the heads and the frames, the bones. Well, first of all, the head is the most nutritious part of the fish, and many people prefer it. I remember working with my colleague who used to be with Tafiri, Ben Ngatunga, and when Ben and I would share a fish, we would fight, and I would let him win the head, because that was the preferred half. So, once again, people approaching it from a cultural standpoint that is reflects their own understanding and preferences rather than those of the people they're working with. But there was a controversy about reduced nutrition, people living around the lake. But when people looked into it, there was a study done that suggested that whereas household-based fishing enabled access of all members of the household to the benefits from fish, when it became more of a market commodity, men were getting cash rather than fish, and the cash was not necessarily being equally distributed within the household. Women were excluded from some of the household-based fishing activities in this new sort of commercially orientated fishery, and so that it was intra-household distribution issues rather than lack of availabilities of fish that was causing some of the potential loss of nutrition. But even that story was debated. So the end picture was that people didn't really know what the complicated implications were, and to blame trade, I think, was too simple, and I think that's what most people have said about this film, that it tells a much too simple version of a complicated story. The Lake Victoria region is vibrant economically, and the fish trade has contributed to that. Has it contributed to rising inequalities? Perhaps, but so has the wider governance context. A complex of factors that can't be all landed to blame on the Nile perch. So this story about if you export fish, does that mean that there's less fish for people to eat? If you look at fish availability and exports, here's just a couple of examples. We've done this for a number of countries. We're currently analysing this data. But if you look at apparent consumption, which is basically the production plus imports minus exports available at a national level, and take Bangladesh, well, apparent consumption in Bangladesh, if you were looking and saying this in about 1990, you'd say, well, you've got a rise in imports there and a decrease in per capita availability. Exporting fish from Bangladesh is causing a decline. But if you look at the whole time series, you see that the value of trade is increasing, but so is the availability of fish in domestic markets. And one of the reasons for this is that aquaculture has developed, initially for export, shrimp and so on, but the spin-offs from that have led to the development of a domestic aquaculture industry. And my Bangladeshi colleagues here will tell me more. But now I believe that farmed fish is the lowest price, the cheapest price fish available in Bangladesh. So aquaculture has, an export-orientated aquaculture has led to the development of aquaculture for food security as well. In the Philippines, the story is less clear. Bangladesh's economy has been growing during this period, and that's perhaps reflected in increased production and export. The Philippines, the economy has not grown in the same way that many of the surrounding nations have during this period. And apparent consumption has sort of fluctuated around a similar level and perhaps has slightly declined over a period when exports at first boomed and then sort of flattened off and decreased. So contrasting stories in each country, and we've mapped out, I think for about 25 countries, these stories, and we're trying to look now at methods of analysing these time series to answer this question: do exports decrease the supply of fish available to consumers? A lot of the story can't be told without access to price data, and price data over these long time periods. For the whole complex of species, it becomes a very complicated story. We hope to be able to tell it very simply with these aggregate quantities, but we may not be able to do that. Some people have tried to do that, and there was a paper appeared which looked at the prices of internationally traded seafood for developed and developing countries for the 1970s and 80s. And they showed that the price of fish that developing countries were importing was decreasing. So developing countries were importing lower value fish, both from each other and from developed countries, and were exporting high value fish, so that there was a net gain or benefit from exports. So the value of high value fish exports was greater than the imports of lower value fish. So arguably, exports allow you to import low value fish which address the food security needs of the poorer people in your population. So you make the most of, why eat prawns, octopus, red snapper and other things when you could sell those things and buy horse mackerel, herring and other good nutritious fish for lower price. That's the pro-trade argument.
I was just commenting that one time I was reading a book by somebody in Iceland here, and the title of the book is The Code, the book that changed world trade. And in that book somebody was asked why Icelanders eat haddock and sell cod. Then the Icelanders said, they are not stupid, they don't eat money. So if we also do such things like Victoria, we also don't want to eat money. Like buy it's our money, we sell that one, and then eat the remaining.
And you know, we've seen some rise in fish prices that have made fish less affordable in general. In some places, much more. I've seen a recent analysis in the US, for example, where fish prices are now much, much higher than you know, chicken and even beef. Whereas fish was once the cheap source of animal protein, it's now the most expensive. I haven't seen those data for globally yet, more recent data, but what we see is that the price of farmed fish has dropped and is lower now in general. The aquaculture is the bottom line there, and the capture fisheries price index has generally shown an increase, a peak around about the time that world food prices peaked in 2008, and since a little bit of a drop.
Does that have to do with the species?
Yeah, the FAO Fish Price Index is from a complex of traded species, and the authors of this paper have recently argued that they think that the prices reasonably track all traded fish, and even internally traded fish, although the actual level of the price may be different, that you know the variations are similar.
Yeah.
So the kinds of questions that we ask is, okay, well maybe you know fish trade doesn't cause any harm to fish availability and domestic fish prices. So it doesn't reduce people's access to fish. But does it actually bring economic benefits? So is a trade orientation leading to poverty reduction? Well, we did an analysis for the journal World Development a while back to test the claim that said, well, you must export, you must restructure your fisheries to make them access the global markets. And this would mean, in many countries, moving away from a sort of artisanal, highly distributed mode of production to a more concentrated, industrial, export-orientated mode of production. And so what we did basically is we tested the country, we looked to see if the countries that exported more fish, if the growth in fish exports was in some way related to any visible effect on national poverty indicators. We didn't pick up any signal. Now, I'm not that surprised about that. All we did was we tested the claims that, oh, you know, these fish exports are alleviating poverty in Africa. So we said, well, you haven't proved that case. That's all. I'm not saying that our study said you shouldn't do it and it's not making any difference. All we said is we couldn't find it, and the people who claim it should do some econometrics to prove it before claiming it. So, you know, I think that the story about what kind of market development do you need for fisheries in Africa, in other countries, is still open to question. I think in Asia a lot of fish now are traded regionally, not necessarily orientated towards you know, developed country Western markets, very large internal markets. A lot of trade is redirected towards Japan, which, by the way, is a net exporter of fish. Many people worry about China's, you know, fish footprint or whatever, but China's a net exporter of fish. And so a lot more work needs to be done on deciding what kinds of markets are appropriate to work with. And one of the concerns is that, you know, the women in this picture, small-scale fish traders, supplying regional, local markets in the rush to supply fish to export markets to generate more revenue, that you also have a potential impact on the distributional benefits of the fish trade. If you restructure the fish value chain, you could find that you reduce women's economic independence, for example. So yes, maybe these women will find jobs in fish processing factories, but that's a different kind of livelihood to being an independent fish trader, to being an entrepreneur. You become a factory employee. It's not necessarily an increase in well-being, even though it may generate in aggregate more profits. So these are the kinds of things that, policymakers, development analysts, people investing in value chain upgrading, in new processing technologies, and so on, have to consider. Okay, finally, I want to turn to what the role of sort of discussions about policy in fisheries have on the social distribution of benefits from fisheries. So it's hardly ever asked, but it's assumed that you manage fisheries, and most countries have got some kind of target. Often that target says we're going to maximize profits, we're going to conserve biodiversity, we're going to develop aquaculture, and we're going to maximize employment, and we're also going to maximize the supply of cheap fish. Now, those of you who've done your fisheries stock assessment will realize that you can't do all of those things at once, that those are trade-offs. You can paddle your policy canoe in any one of these directions, up to you. But you can't paddle it in all those directions at once. So, keep this picture in mind. You can conserve biodiversity, maximize revenues, minimize the supply of cheap fish, maximize employment, or just let the fishery do whatever and save yourself the money of managing it. Stock assessment scientists will, of course, recognize the Gordon-Schaefer curve. Okay. Basically, this is a kind of maximum sustainable yield curve. Maximum sustainable yield corresponds to the maximum supply of fish. This is about maximum economic yield over here. This is an underexploited fishery, but low exploitation rates mean that the species that are vulnerable to fishing won't disappear from your multi-species fishery. They'll still be there, so you've conserved biodiversity. You ramp up the effort, yes, more people can get employed, but profits go down, and you go way over the top there, you'll drive your fishery down to very low catch per unit effort, very high effort, and profits dissipated, basically, rent dissipated. Once you move beyond the open access equilibrium, if this is the cost curve, and that's the revenue curve, where they intersect, essentially there's no net profit in the fishery. And many people say that that's where we've allowed fisheries to get in many cases. And we can push them over the top if we subsidize them. The point here being is that you can make a choice about where you want your fishery to be, anywhere along that curve, recognizing that, this model is a gross oversimplification and that fisheries don't work in this nice, simple way. Nevertheless, people still use this model, and I think it's still the legal basis for international fisheries governance, MSY, isn't it? Yeah. So, there are kind of two basic arguments about how we should think about and manage global fishery resources. The World Bank and the Global Partnership on Oceans have decided to call their strategy something called wealth-based fisheries. And the idea was that we can generate more wealth from fisheries if we reduce fishing effort, maximize revenues and profits. Okay, so that you can maximize the value of fisheries and also conserve resources and move fisheries from the overexploited area here, where you've got a large number of people dependent on fisheries, but none of them are making a huge amount of money, to essentially using the resources for maximum economic gain. And they estimated that if you did that, you could make $50 billion a year by basically reducing overfishing that is caused by illegal or unregulated and unreported fishing. And Ragnar Arnason was the key person behind this sunken billions study, designed the model and the analysis. And the team at FAO, led by Rolf Willman, were the partners. I never know how to cite this study. I've seen it cited in about 20 different times. I think this version I presented to FAO, so it's got Rolf Willman's name. If I'd known that I was going to present it again here, I would have changed it to Arnason et al. Wealth-based fisheries management essentially seeks to capture the sunken billions by strengthening property rights, reducing fishing effort, tackling illegal fishing, and increasing the resource rents. And it basically requires a transformation of current fisheries. All those, people generating low rents, overcapitalized, subsidized fisheries. The rationale for this, the kind of theory of change, if you like, is articulated in a paper by fisheries economist Cunningham. I've forgotten his first name. I know it. Anyway. The overall theory of change is that transforming fishery governance using a fishing rights-based approach leads to increased resource rents, which are then spent to reduce poverty beyond the fishing sector. And, it makes perfect sense. It requires that you have a fishery resource that's currently dissipating rent, and that it's big enough and valuable enough to provide significant rent gains if you invest in managing it better. So it is perhaps best suited to places which have substantial fishery resources that can contribute significant amounts to national GDP. It's probably not worth doing in a place where fisheries are pretty marginal. It also assumes that there's a capacity, or that you can build the capacity to govern resources to generate those maximum rents, or that once you sort out the right systems through privatization, for example, that capacity will develop. It also assumes that you've got mechanisms and capacity to collect and direct the rents towards the state departments that are responsible for social service provision and poverty reduction, for example. So it has to mean that the rents that go to government, that go to the private sector, end up benefiting economic growth and poverty reduction. That they're not sort of spirited away in some other way or squandered. And as well as having your fishery governance system working well, you also have to have your national political economy aligned towards benefiting poverty reduction. Now, if all these conditions apply, then you can direct those extra revenues towards poverty reduction. If they're problematic in any way, at any stage in this, then you may not realize the benefits that you could theoretically gain. And I think those of us who worry about this model say that there's a bit of a gap between the theoretical rent gain and the capacity to realize those gains due to weaknesses in governance system that can't be fixed by property rights reform alone. Okay, and that's basically our argument against this. And we challenged it in a paper that's probably made them very cross, I'm not sure. They occasionally speak to me, but not often. And I don't think they speak to Chris Benet. And Bjorn Hersug is a Norwegian fisheries economist. And I think opinion in Norway is divided on this model. I think a lot of the Norwegian fishery economists have been behind the development of this. And in Norway, we've seen a transformation of a kind of artisanal fishery into an efficient, smaller industrial fleet that required basically a 90% reduction in employment for the rent gains to be realized. So if you did that globally, you'd, if there's, say, I don't know what the current estimate is, about 35, 40 million people involved in fishing. for this model to be transformed completely in that way, you probably end up with 1/10 of the current number of fisherfolk. So many people look at the potential social costs of that, and we did. And we decided that welfare contribution was about $60 billion a year in terms of wages and things. So to gain the 50 billion, you'd have to spend 60 billion. So probably not much net change. You just redirect the flows of resources. And we were worried about it being applied everywhere. Perhaps we were attacking a straw man, that it was never the intent to apply this everywhere and indiscriminately. And in fact, the Global Partnership on Oceans, the World Bank, have modified the goals to account for community quotas, for looking at social benefits beyond rent and so on. So, the actual implementation of this program is much more broad and nuanced than the initial theoretical proposal would suggest, and I think that's quite normal in economic policy. So we felt that it was important in those countries where you couldn't guarantee that this extra rent would result in poverty reduction, to preserve the capacity of small-scale fisheries to provide labour and cash income until conditions were such. If you look at oil revenues, okay, Norway does a good job of managing its fish stocks, but also its oil revenues. There are some countries that are oil-rich that don't do such a good job of directing their oil reserves, their oil wealth, into widespread poverty reduction. Okay. I'm not going to name them. Does anyone want to name one?
Anybody living?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I spent part of my childhood in Nigeria, and I've recently been working in Nigeria in the Niger Delta, and so I've followed the story of Nigeria, and it's a country with enormous potential, with a sort of vibrant economic sector and tremendous human capacity that has had problems in generating and distributing the benefits from its oil and its timber. And natural resource wealth is sometimes a curse. You've probably all heard of the resource curse. And one of my concerns is that why should fish be any different? And the difference between fish and oil is that at least you can eat the fish. And so there are alternative ways of using the fish resource, whereas oil, you probably need some kind of large-scale industrial process and a big public-private partnership to get it. You don't necessarily need that model to get at your fish resources, certainly not your inshore ones. So a kind of, a different approach might be, a more gradual one might be needed. But I think, there is an appetite globally for transformative change. We worry about fish stocks and their sustainability. We want to make a big difference with a big radical change of policy. And I think, this was an attempt to start that discussion and to get that happening. And I think those who want radical change are a little bit frustrated by those of us who say, we're a bit worried about this, slow it down, think it through, do it differently in every case, all of this kind of gradualist approach. But that's the nature of policy debate. And we've had these kinds of debates in agriculture, the productivity of small farms debate. Let's have it in fisheries too. Let's open that debate up, let's participate in that debate. Let's relate it to the context that we all work in rather than just accepting some blanket model. So what we've argued for is, in order to get those kinds of benefits that are theoretically obtainable, if we could manage fisheries better and if we could direct resource rents towards poverty reduction, is we'd have to do things a little bit differently to how we've done them so far. So what we've tended to do in fisheries is we see securing fishing rights and improving access to global markets as the way to go. And what's often happened is we've connected fisheries, sometimes with development support, sometimes private sectors have done it themselves, with improved access to global markets. And what has sometimes happened as a result of that is it's in the absence of secure fishing rights, of secure property rights, it's simply accelerated the decline in resources. So it's led to the scramble of resources, off the coast of West Africa, for example. And then you have high-value resources like sea urchin, sea cucumber fisheries. Very quickly got connected to global markets. Before anybody could develop the capacity to assess and manage these fisheries, they'd more or less disappeared. So what we've done in the past is first improved access to global markets, then secured fishing rights, and that's it. We haven't really worried about the distribution of those rights and protecting those people who might be affected. So what we're suggesting is to reverse that sequence, to first think about if you want to grant rights, for example, to community members, to small-scale fishers, try and improve their security such that they can claim those rights and can defend them against incursions by the more powerful. So if someone comes in, fishes in your area, you can take that person to court. That you have access to justice, for example. That you can get secure fishing rights, and then when those sorts of conditions in place, then have your aggressive campaign to improve access to global markets. If you do it the other way around, you're going to deplete your fishery, and it's going to end up in the hands of the powerful, and it's going to marginalize your small-scale fishers. That's what we suggest anyway. Back down to the micro scale, there's a whole bunch of things that you can do to improve fisher folks' lives without necessarily doing that sort of big global policy change and global market linkages. There's a range of micro-level interventions that can be done, and many local government departments, NGOs, civil society organizations are involved in addressing the 3 dimensions of poverty in various ways like this, both through policy, land tenure, rights of indigenous people, strengthening judicial systems so that people can, making local government more accountable, making sure that fishing communities are incorporated in things like disaster preparedness and response schemes, in programs to develop insurance and index-linked insurance, microcredit, and so on. Getting people improved health services and improved access to social protection. Social protection schemes have tried to reduce inequalities and vulnerabilities around the world. I don't know how much reach they've had in fishing communities. They've tended to be targeted towards agriculture, vulnerable small-scale agriculture. I don't think fishing communities have been included much. Most of the people involved in social protection have not known enough about fishing communities to know what kinds of social protection people need. And there's been a lot of interest in fishing communities of promoting livelihood diversification, new enterprise development, to try and reduce dependency on fisheries. To try to reduce the pressure on fisheries as well. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you can do. You don't have to sit by and say, oh, well, fisheries, too difficult, not much you can do. There is a range of things you can do. Doesn't mean you have to do all of these. And some people say when they see this kind of list and the previous one, they say, well, first you want to fix the world before you can fish fisheries. You're crazy, I don't think you need to do that. I think you just need to find what the binding constraint is, what the issue or the problem is in the system where you're working, in the place, in the country, with the community, with the people that you're working with. And say, well, what is it that people need here from this menu? And then you don't have to do it all. You don't have to eat everything on the menu. You can just pick the one that is most suited. The binding constraints. The World Bank is doing the same. It has an approach called growth diagnostics. It looks at the binding constraints to growth through a diagnosis of the kind of national political economy. And having identified that, that's what they target their investment towards. So this on a micro scale and in a sectoral context is a similar sort of idea. There's also a lot you can do with the existing governance system that is not necessarily directed towards fisheries. We tend to think, aquaculture development, and fisheries management are our only two tools. We use one or the other, the hammer or the chisel. But there's a whole toolbox, and other people have it. So as well as the fisheries laws and policies, you have a whole bunch of things that regulate trade, that can help deal with some of these inequities, for example. You have a whole range of ocean management, ocean environmental and habitat management schemes out there. You have a range of development targets. This one's a bit out of date. They're now called the Sustainable Development Targets. You have the whole human rights legislation, food safety, and environmental legislation more generally. And all of these can and are being brought into fisheries governance. So when you think about fisheries management or aquaculture development, you're actually thinking about this broader context. This is the governance, or part of the governance system. And then underneath that, you have all the local institutions that we talked about before. So the governance system is complex. You have a lot of range of options. So understanding that governance system becomes part of the professional task so that you can find the most effective ways to leverage this governance environment to help you achieve what you want to achieve. And a key neglected dimension, well understood by this Ghanaian fishing boat owner, is that we tend not to think when we do policy analysis, when we think about the opportunities, about how pervasive relationships of power are, and how we need to understand them and work with them and challenge them where necessary in order to achieve poverty reduction. Because poverty is partly the consequence of unequal access to opportunity. And unequal access is maintained by those who have a vested interest in doing so. So it's the powerful keeping the less powerful away from opportunity. So that's the summary. I think if you want to govern fisheries and aquaculture successfully, you need an explicit understanding of the linkages across sectors and also across scales from the local to the global. Having a better understanding of what people do, what regulates their ability to do things and not to do other things, what role that culture plays in what people think of as possible and desirable, what people want, aspirations. It occurs to me that nobody's really done a major study of what young people in fishing communities want. It's been done a little bit in farming communities, and while people are trying to do agriculture development, young people are leaving farms like crazy, How many of you left farms to do something else? Yeah, what's so special about us? There's a whole bunch of other young people in fishing and farming that also want to go and do something else. But we haven't asked them. Very few, and when they do ask, a lot of the well-being satisfaction surveys, job satisfaction work, there's quite a theme on job satisfaction in fisheries. Guess who they've talked to? Men. Yeah, I love fishing. Gives me independence, gives me a whole bunch of things. I don't think anyone's asked women fish traders, what do you enjoy about your job? How satisfied are you with that? What is it that you aspire to? So there are whole elements of our understanding that are missing. And that limits our ability to formulate policies and programs that help those that we're supposed to serve as civil servants, as NGO workers or whoever. And basically reinforcing that message that understanding power relations, incentives and values is fundamental if we're going to succeed, and a lot of useful stuff is already in place, but we don't always use it in the fishery sector, so we should. Key question, of course, balancing. On the one hand, you have one Nile perch in one hand, you have another in the other. Can you both alleviate poverty and sustain resources in small-scale fisheries? That's a question really that we need to ask over the next week or so. How do you do it? One suggestion that I have here is, yes, you need to restrict access to resources to improve property rights, but instead of using the kind of fixed barriers that we tend to use in developed countries, individual transferable quotas, territorial use rights, why not build on the traditional systems that people have in countries where people have been fishing for a long time in these ways? Basically reciprocal access. So you have a filter. You let some people in some of the time. And most traditional systems operate like this. You don't exclude people completely, you let them under certain conditions, and so on. And rather than always trying to sort of deal with resource governance and income improvements, look at vulnerability reduction as a means of alleviating poverty as well. You reduce people's vulnerability, they'll find their own ways and their own methods of accumulating assets and increasing their income. Thanks very much.